There's a strange moment that happens in ordinary places. You're in a grocery store, fluorescent lights humming overhead, competing music from different aisles, the metallic scrape of shopping carts, the shuffle and rustle of dozens of bodies moving through narrow corridors. The air itself feels thick with stimulation, and then, without warning, your nervous system says no more. Not panic, not fear of anything specific, just a complete bodily shutdown. You look around. Everyone else seems fine. They're comparing prices, checking their phones, moving through this environment like it's neutral space. But for you, it's become unbearable. The question forms, quiet and familiar. What's wrong with me? This moment has other locations. The dinner party where you're tracking every micro-expression around the table, processing the subtle tension between two guests, absorbing the host's anxiety about whether the food is good enough. The work meeting where you're still integrating yesterday's feedback, while everyone else has moved on. The unexplainable exhaustion that makes people ask, "Why are you so tired?" You didn't even do anything. You feel raw, porous, like you're absorbing everything without a filter. Here's what most people think this is: anxiety disorder, social phobia, weakness, just being too sensitive. Said with that particular tone that means you need to toughen up. The cultural story is clear. You're not adapting properly to normal life. But this is not pathology. This is neurobiology. 15 to 20% of humans are wired this way. Your nervous system isn't malfunctioning, it's operating according to a different design. A century ago, Carl Jung recognized this pattern and called it innate sensitiveness. Not a disorder to fix, but a constitutional difference in how consciousness processes reality. This video reveals the hidden psychological architecture of high sensitivity. You'll understand why you process the world this way, what operates beneath your awareness, and how to transform sensitivity from burden into compass, from wound into instrument of individuation. Because the overwhelm that nobody sees, it's the entry point to depth that most people will never access. So what is this exactly? Not a condition, not something that needs treatment or correction. High sensitivity is a trait, a stable temperamental characteristic present in approximately 15 to 20% of humans. It appears across over 100 animal species, from fruit flies to primates, which tells us something crucial. This is an evolved survival strategy, not a modern psychological malfunction. This matters because high sensitivity is often confused with other patterns. It's not anxiety, though you may experience anxiety. It's not autism, though both involve processing differences. It's not ADHD, though both affect stimulation thresholds. Research shows that sensitivity is statistically independent from neuroticism and introversion, which means you can be sensitive and emotionally stable, sensitive and extroverted. 30% of highly sensitive people are extroverts. The trait itself is neutral architecture. The lived experience operates through 4 interconnected mechanisms. First, depth of processing. You don't skim experience. Everything receives thorough, multi-layered analysis. Second, overstimulation. Not because you're fragile, but because you're processing more data through more channels simultaneously. Third, emotional reactivity and empathy. Both positive and negative experiences land with amplified intensity. Fourth, sensitivity to subtleties. You detect changes in environment, mood, and relational dynamics that others don't register. And once you notice, you can't unnotice. This creates what Jung recognized as a fundamental paradox. He wrote that excessive sensitiveness very often brings an enrichment of the personality, but noted that this advantage frequently turns to great disadvantage when difficult situations arise. The same depth of processing that generates vivid dreams, strong intuition, and rich inner worlds also creates vulnerability to overwhelm. You're not processing the same information more intensely than others. You're processing different information, more information, through additional perceptual channels. This is not a volume problem. This is architecture. The question becomes, what is this architecture accessing, and why does it create such specific psychological challenges? That requires understanding what's happening beneath the observable experience. The neural mechanisms that distinguish your processing from the majority pattern. The phenomenology establishes that something real is happening, measurable, consistent, cross-culturally observed. Now we move beneath the surface to examine the mechanism. What neural architecture produces these experiences, and what does that architecture access psychologically? Brain imaging studies reveal something remarkable. When highly sensitive individuals process stimuli, particularly emotional or socially relevant information, specific neural regions show measurably greater activation than in non-sensitive populations. The anterior insula lights up with heightened intensity. This region has been called the seat of consciousness. It integrates thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations into unified awareness. Your insula doesn't just register that something is happening. It synthesizes what it means across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Emotional memory systems activate more strongly. Mirror neuron networks show enhanced responsiveness, creating automatic emotional resonance with others' internal states. Brain areas responsible for awareness, empathy, and self-other processing all demonstrate increased engagement. This is not metaphor. This is not your imagination compensating for weakness. This is measurable neural architecture operating according to different specifications. Jung recognized this pattern a century before functional MRI technology existed. In his clinical observations, he noted that approximately 25% of his patients exhibited what he called innate sensitiveness, a constitutional predisposition toward thorough conscious and unconscious reflection on experiences. He couldn't see the neural substrates, but he accurately identified the psychological result. These individuals processed reality through additional layers of meaning-making that others simply didn't access. He also recognized something crucial. This architecture creates proximity to unconscious material. Psychologist Elaine Aron, who established the empirical foundation for sensitivity research, describes it as a thinner boundary between conscious and unconscious mental processes. Your conscious ego receives more data from unconscious systems, more dreams, stronger intuitions, heightened awareness of symbolic dimensions that others experience as background noise. This is why you can't just decide to process less. You're not choosing to overthink or feel too much. Your nervous system is structured to engage semantic meaning-making, pattern recognition, and emotional integration at deeper levels than the majority configuration. The conscious mind receives a higher volume of information from regions that, in most people, operate largely below awareness. Understanding the mechanism changes everything. Because once you recognize that you're working with different neural equipment, the question shifts. Not, how do I become normal, but what is this architecture designed to access, and what does that demand psychologically? The answer takes us into territory Jung understood intimately, the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. That thinner boundary between conscious and unconscious processes creates something specific: permeability. Your dreams arrive with unusual vividness, not just visual clarity, but emotional intensity that lingers for hours after waking. Your intuition operates with striking accuracy, delivering information you couldn't have consciously assembled. You perceive symbolic dimensions in everyday events that others experience as literal and neutral. Aron describes this as seeing in technicolor, while others see only drab grays. This isn't poetic exaggeration. It's accurate description of what happens when the membrane between conscious awareness and unconscious processes becomes more porous. Jung understood the unconscious as communicating through specific channels: images, symbols, affects, Emotional charges attached to psychic content. These are precisely the channels through which you naturally receive information. Where others might experience a mood as diffuse background noise, you receive it as distinct communication carrying meaning. Where others dismiss a dream as random neural firing, you recognize coherent symbolic narrative. The unconscious speaks, and your architecture is designed to hear it. This creates what Aaron identified as a paradox. Highly sensitive people individuate more easily than others, and also need to more if we are not going to be ruled by our unconscious. Translation: you have natural access to the material required for psychological development, the dreams, intuitions, and symbolic perceptions that guide individuation, Jung's term for becoming who you actually are beneath social conditioning. But this same access creates vulnerability. The unconscious doesn't just offer wisdom, it also contains autonomous complexes, feeling-toned splinter psyches that can possess consciousness when triggered. Daily life continuously activates archetypal layers that others never touch. You can't selectively open channels. The permeability that grants access to depth also admits overwhelm. This is why toughening up is not only ineffective but impossible. You're not being mentally weak when you're flooded by emotion or overstimulated by environment. Your nervous system is processing more data through more channels, sensory, emotional, symbolic, relational, and integrating it across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Trying to override this is like demanding your liver filter less blood. The organ is functioning according to its design. The task is not suppression. The task is developing conscious relationship with what flows through these open channels, learning to differentiate signal from noise, personal emotion from absorbed affect, intuitive knowing from anxious projection. But first you need to understand what happens when this permeability meets childhood wounding, because the same architecture that creates potential for depth also creates vulnerability to fragmentation. And for most highly sensitive people, that fragmentation begins early. We've established the what and the how, the traits, characteristics, and its neural psychological mechanisms. Now we descend into the shadows. What happens when this architecture encounters developmental wounding, cultural devaluation, and the unconscious adaptations required for survival? Developmental psychologist Thomas Boyce spent 4 decades researching what he calls orchid children, children with heightened biological reactivity who represent approximately 20% of the population. His findings reveal a pattern that fundamentally reframes sensitivity. In poor quality care environments, orchid children develop the most severe behavioral problems, emotional dysregulation, and psychological distress. But in high quality care environments, these same children demonstrate the fewest problems, better outcomes than non-reactive dandelion children who remain relatively unaffected by environmental quality. This is differential susceptibility, for better and for worse. Not vulnerability alone, but plasticity, malleability, heightened responsiveness to experience in both directions. Your nervous system encoded early relational experiences with greater depth and persistence than non-sensitive children. Parental attunement, or its absence, registered with amplified intensity. When caregivers failed to mirror your emotional states accurately, when their responses didn't match what you were actually feeling, the distortions in self-representation went deeper. The emotional memories formed more vivid neural traces, the relational templates became more persistent, and the messages, those casual repeated statements that shaped your understanding of your own nature, landed with particular force. Don't be so sensitive. You're too much. What's wrong with you? Why can't you just be normal? Jung called these emotionally charged experiences complexes, autonomous splinter psyches organized around a nuclear element, often archetypal, that gather energy through repeated similar experiences. A complex is the image of a certain psychic situation, which is strongly accentuated emotionally and is, moreover, incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. For sensitive individuals, two characteristic complexes emerge from childhood wounding. The vulnerable, tough complex creates oscillation between feeling hopelessly fragile and compulsively forcing hardness, a polarity that flips you from one extreme to the other when triggered. The inferior-superior complex produces swings between deflation, seeing yourself as fundamentally defective, and inflation, feeling special or superior because of your sensitivity. Both patterns operate autonomously. They can possess consciousness without your consent, activated by situations that echo the original wounding. The task is not to eliminate these complexes, they're structural components of your psyche now. The task is transformation, shifting from wound-based identity to conscious relationship with your core trait. From being possessed by the complex to recognizing when it's activated. But that requires understanding what else got pushed into darkness during those formative years. Because the messages didn't just create complexes, they forced your essential nature itself into shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is the inferior part of the personality, qualities incompatible with your chosen conscious attitude that coalesce into autonomous contrary tendencies. What gets pushed into shadow is culturally relative. It depends on what your family system and broader culture value. Western industrial culture systematically shadows sensitivity. It valorizes speed over depth, emotional detachment over responsiveness, extroversion over introversion, decisive action over careful reflection. The cultural ideal is the warrior, stoic, impervious, rapidly adaptive, emotionally controlled. Against this backdrop, your core trait becomes problematic. The messages arrive early and repeat often. Stop being so emotional. You think too much. Why are you so antisocial? That's not rational. Don't be so sensitive, said with that particular inflection that means there's something wrong with you, so you learn to hide it. Push it down. Adapt. Your emotional responsiveness goes into shadow. Your need for solitude gets buried. Your deep processing becomes something you apologize for. Your intuitive knowing is dismissed as irrational. Your capacity for empathy itself, the very architecture that allows you to sense others' internal states, becomes a source of shame. Jung recognized something crucial about this process. 80% of the shadow is pure gold. The shadow doesn't just contain what's genuinely problematic. It contains rejected positive qualities, capacities that were shamed or devalued by your environment, but that represent your actual gifts. For highly sensitive individuals, this means your greatest capacities are often in your shadow. Creativity, deep perception, spiritual sensitivity, the ability to process symbolic and archetypal dimensions that others can't access. These aren't just buried, they're actively influencing your behavior from the unconscious while remaining unavailable to your conscious personality. The consequences compound: chronic shame, development of a false self constructed to appear normal, depression that feels like essential nature suffocating under adaptive strategy, loss of access to your actual gifts, and shadow acting out, the disowned sensitivity emerging in uncontrolled ways. Sudden emotional flooding, unexplained reactivity, somatic symptoms that express what consciousness won't acknowledge. The collective dimension intensifies this. Cultures project their own shadow onto minority populations. In societies that reject depth, receptivity, and emotional complexity, sensitive individuals become carriers of everything the dominant culture disavows. You're not just dealing with personal shadow, you're carrying collective shadow material. For men, this becomes particularly acute. Sensitivity traits get coded as feminine, and therefore shameful within traditional masculinity frameworks. The sensitive man faces a double bind. His neurobiology ensures emotional intensity, while his cultural conditioning demands stoicism. The dissonance creates specific pain, mismanaged emotions, substance use, depression rooted in the impossibility of living up to masculine ideals that contradict neurobiological reality. But shadow formation is only half the story, because in order to function in environments hostile to your nature, you didn't just push sensitivity into darkness. You built something to conceal it. Jung defined the persona as a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, a mask designed to make a specific impression on others while concealing the true nature of the individual. The persona is necessary for social functioning. The danger lies in over-identification with the mask. You learned early that authentic expression of your sensitivity brought negative consequences. Showing overwhelm invited contempt. Expressing emotional depth created discomfort. Requesting quiet produced judgment. So you adapted. You developed a persona to appear normal in overstimulating environments. You hid emotional reactions deemed excessive. You suppressed your need for solitude to fit social expectations. You masked the depth of your processing to seem appropriately surface level. You pretended not to notice what you couldn't help but notice. This parallels what autism researchers call masking, the phenomenon of suppressing natural neurodivergent responses to perform neurotypical behavior. Forcing eye contact that feels invasive. Maintaining false cheerfulness while internally overwhelmed. Hiding stimming behaviors. Pushing through sensory distress without external indication. The neurological cost is severe. You're running your nervous system in a configuration that contradicts its design, working against your brain's natural processing architecture. Maintaining this contradiction requires enormous psychic energy that becomes unavailable for actual development, creativity, or authentic relationship. When the persona becomes too rigid or dominant, the authentic self becomes inaccessible even to you. You find yourself stuck in work that doesn't fit, relationships that require ongoing performance, communities where you don't actually belong, and you can't access the emotional honesty required to change any of it because the mask has become the identity. Jung warned that such identification with social roles is a very fruitful source of neuroses. A man cannot get rid of himself in favor of an artificial personality without punishment. For highly sensitive individuals, the punishment manifests as burnout, anxiety, loss of identity, and the persistent feeling of living someone else's life. The repressed authentic self doesn't disappear. It pushes back through dreams that reveal what you're denying, through symptoms that express what consciousness won't acknowledge, through depression that signals the soul's refusal to continue the charade. Healthy persona development means conscious awareness of when and how you're masking, the capacity to wear social masks strategically, grounded in authentic self-knowledge without identifying with the performance. But there's another layer beneath the persona problem, because it's not just that you hide your sensitivity from others. You've also become an unconscious receptacle for what others can't tolerate in themselves. Projective identification is distinct from simple projection. In projection, someone attributes their own feelings to you. They're angry, but accuse you of being angry. In projective identification, they unconsciously offload their feelings onto you, and you actually experience those emotions as if they were your own. This is not metaphor, it's a measurable psychological mechanism with neural substrates. Your mirror neuron systems create automatic emotional resonance with others' internal states. Your heightened insular activation increases awareness of subtle affective cues. Your deep processing of social emotional information means you're tracking relational dynamics that most people register only peripherally. These aren't choices. This is how your architecture operates. Many highly sensitive people grew up in family systems where they functioned as emotional containers, holding parental anxiety, absorbing unprocessed grief, carrying rage that parents couldn't acknowledge. You learned that maintaining attachment required taking on others' feelings. The pattern became automatic. Here's what it looks like now. You're in conversation with someone feeling relatively neutral. Then suddenly, a wave of shame that doesn't connect to anything you've done, or anger that has no clear object, or anxiety that seems sourceless. The emotional shift is abrupt, intense, and confusing. The diagnostic question is simple. Was I feeling this before this interaction? When someone cannot tolerate their own shadow material, their anger, shame, fear, inadequacy, they may unconsciously deposit it into the interpersonal field. Your natural receptivity and empathic attunement make you particularly susceptible to absorbing what doesn't belong to you. You become the container for feelings someone else refuses to feel. The result is chronic confusion about which emotions are yours and which are absorbed. Exhaustion from carrying others' unprocessed material. Difficulty trusting your own emotional reality because the boundaries between self and other have become permeable to the point of dissolution. This reveals the central psychological task for highly sensitive individuals: boundary development. Not as behavioral strategy, but as fundamental individuation work. Because you were born with thin boundaries as a feature of your design, but you must consciously develop what doesn't come naturally. That's where the integration work begins, not with trying to become less sensitive, but with learning to be consciously sensitive, permeable by choice rather than default. The descent into unconscious mechanisms is complete. We've mapped the hidden architecture, complexes, shadow, persona, projective absorption that operates beneath awareness. Now we ascend toward integration. What does conscious relationship with this architecture actually look like? The fundamental reframe begins here. You are not defective. You are plastic. Differential susceptibility theory represents one of the most important paradigm shifts in understanding sensitivity. The traditional model, diathesis stress, viewed sensitivity as vulnerability, a risk factor that predicts poor outcomes under adverse conditions. This framework sees the sensitive individual as constitutionally fragile. Differential susceptibility reveals something entirely different. Sensitive individuals are more negatively affected by adverse environments, yes, but they also benefit more from supportive, enriched contexts, not just returning to baseline, but surpassing non-sensitive individuals in positive outcomes. The research is unambiguous. Orchid children in poor quality childcare show the most behavioral problems and emotional dysregulation. The same children in high-quality care show the fewest problems, better developmental outcomes than dandelion children who remain relatively stable regardless of environmental quality. Physiological markers confirm the pattern. Children with high cortisol reactivity appear least prosocial under adverse conditions, but most prosocial under benign conditions. You are responsive, malleable, more shaped by experience in both directions. This means your challenges may reflect environmental mismatch rather than inherent flaw. The overwhelm, the reactivity, the chronic sense of not fitting, these aren't failures of your psychology. They're accurate responses to environments structured for different nervous systems. It also means that positive experiences, therapeutic relationships, and supportive environments produce disproportionate benefits for you. The same openness that created vulnerability becomes the mechanism of healing. Early intervention matters exceptionally because plasticity cuts both ways. The reframing process is not rationalization. It's accurate reinterpretation of past experience through informed understanding. I responded too slowly becomes I needed longer to process complex information through multiple channels. I overreacted emotionally becomes my nervous system registered and responded to stimuli that others didn't detect. I failed to adapt becomes neither I nor others understood the architectural requirements of my trait. This shift from self-pathologization to recognition of differential design is itself deeply individuating. The ego moves from adversarial relationship with its own nature toward collaborative relationship with constitutional reality. But recognition alone doesn't create integration. That requires the conscious development of what your architecture didn't provide. Boundaries, not as limitation, but as necessary container for the depth you naturally access. Here's the paradox at the center of your development. You were born with thin boundaries as a feature, not a defect. Environmental responsiveness, permeability to subtle stimuli, openness to unconscious material, these are design specifications, not malfunctions. But you must consciously develop what doesn't come naturally. The goal is not thick defensive walls. That would eliminate the trait's advantages, the depth perception, symbolic awareness, and empathic attunement that make you who you are. The goal is what Aaron calls graceful boundaries, conscious permeability, choosing when to be open and when to contain, rather than being involuntarily flooded. This operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Outer boundaries with the world, physical limits on time with others, saying no to overstimulation without shame, protecting energy and attention as finite resources, creating life structures that accommodate rather than override your processing requirements. Inner boundaries with the unconscious, differentiating between ego and unconscious contents flooding awareness, distinguishing your emotions from absorbed emotions, separating personal preferences from internalized shoulds, learning to recognize intuition versus anxiety. The distinction matters because they operate through different channels. Outer boundaries are behavioral, what you do, where you go, how long you stay. Inner boundaries are psychological, what you identify with, what you allow to possess consciousness, how you relate to autonomous psychic contents. Research on interoceptive awareness, conscious perception of bodily states, reveals something unexpected. People with higher body awareness maintain more stable self-other boundaries. This suggests a somatic path forward. Your enhanced body awareness, when properly directed, supports rather than undermines differentiation. The practice is learning to sense where self ends and other begins through bodily cues. Feeling the subtle yes that opens in your chest versus the no that contracts. Noticing when an emotion arrives with your body's signature versus when it feels foreign, grafted on, not quite yours. This is not behavioral boundary setting advice. This is fundamental individuation work for highly sensitive individuals, developing conscious relationship with your own permeability so that depth doesn't mean dissolution. Because boundaries aren't limitations on your sensitivity. They're the container that makes depth sustainable. And once that container exists, your sensitivity can function as it was designed to, as guidance system, as compass toward what's psychologically true. Your emotional responsiveness is not just reactivity. It's a guidance system providing accurate information about environmental quality, relational authenticity, and alignment with your actual nature. You notice the slight hesitation in someone's voice that signals unspoken reservation. You detect inauthenticity before conscious thought can articulate why. You sense bad vibes, which is imprecise language for accurate perception of hostile or dishonest intent that others miss entirely. Your body contracts in certain environments and expands in others, delivering verdict before analysis. This is not anxiety. This is perception followed by appropriate physiological response. Jung described intuition as the bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind, the function that processes patterns and delivers holistic insights without linear reasoning. For highly sensitive individuals, this bridge operates continuously. You're receiving information from unconscious processing systems, symbolic dimensions, and somatic intelligence that non-sensitive individuals access only intermittently, if at all. Integration means learning to trust this compass, to distinguish the signal, genuine intuitive knowing, from the noise of anxious projection, absorbed emotion, and complex activation. The body provides the clearest distinction. Intuition arrives with a sense of clarity, even when the content is uncomfortable. Anxiety arrives with confusion and spinning thoughts. Absorbed emotion feels grafted on, foreign. Intuition feels like recognition, what wholeness looks like for the highly sensitive person. Embracing sensitivity as core identity rather than flaw to overcome. Integrating both receptive and assertive capacities, depth and boundaries, openness and discrimination. Using deep processing consciously for self-development rather than being unconsciously driven by it. And potentially serving collective healing by modeling integrated sensitivity in cultures that have shadowed these qualities. Aaron observes that sensitive people can be emotional leaders. Let's say something sad is happening and you're the first person in the room to cry. Maybe everyone needs to cry, but they're waiting for the first person to start. This is the paradox resolved. Sensitivity becomes strength, not through elimination, but through integration. You don't become less sensitive. You become more consciously sensitive, permeable by choice, grounded in embodiment, related to others with clear boundaries, oriented by your own internal compass toward what actually matters. The ongoing work includes shadow integration, recovering what was pushed into darkness. Complex work, transforming wound-based identity into conscious relationship with your trait. Persona loosening, allowing authentic presence. Active imagination and creative expression, metabolizing unconscious material into symbolic form. This is individuation for the highly sensitive person. Becoming who you actually are beneath the adaptations. This consciousness work is not easy. You're developing what doesn't come naturally. Boundaries, discrimination, conscious relationship with permeability, while learning to use what does come naturally. Depth processing, symbolic perception, empathic attunement. The path requires both accepting your constitutional nature and growing beyond its initial limitations. Aaron's insight remains true. Highly sensitive people individuate more easily and need to more. You have natural access to the material required for psychological development. But without conscious work, that access becomes overwhelm rather than wisdom. The transformation available moves through specific shifts, from sensitivity as burden to sensitivity as compass. From shame about your trait to integration of your trait. From unconscious possession by complexes to conscious relationship with autonomous contents. From fragmentation under stimulation to wholeness that includes vulnerability. You were born with particular psychological equipment, understanding its neural mechanisms, its susceptibility patterns, its shadow formations and persona constructions. This changes everything. The work is making conscious what was unconscious. Recovering what was pushed into darkness, learning to metabolize rather than be flooded by what you perceive, becoming who you actually are beneath the adaptations built for survival. Thank you for exploring this with me. If this resonated, I invite you to like and subscribe. This work deepens when we're not alone in it. Share this with someone who might recognize themselves here, and leave a comment with your reflections. What part of this analysis landed most deeply for you? What are you noticing about your own sensitivity that you hadn't seen before? Thank you for doing this consciousness work. See you in the next exploration.